In the permafrost of northeastern Siberia, miners have pulled mammoths from the ice with their last meal still in their stomachs. Buttercups, grass, a wildflower called ranunculus that only grows in temperate sunlit conditions. These animals were grazing on an open steppe one moment. The next, they were sealed into cold sediment so completely that the digestive enzymes in their own stomachs never finished their work on the flowers they had just swallowed. In some of the recovered specimens, the soft tissues are preserved well enough that early 20th century expeditions reported the flesh as still recognisably red. A small number retained eye tissue in the sockets. That biological detail, wildflowers still recognisable in the gut of a 10,000-year-old corpse, is one of the most disturbing pieces of physical evidence we have about how quickly the world can change. And it is not an isolated mystery. It is one data point in a much larger pattern. The Earth has a history of these moments. Sudden, total, indifferent. They have drained seas and raised them. They have dismantled languages, swallowed coastlines whole, and reduced our entire species on at least one occasion to a population that could have fit inside a single sports stadium. Everything you have ever been taught about ancient history fits inside the last 5,000 years. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Between those two numbers is a vast and mostly silent archive. Worlds that rose and were dismantled before anyone alive could write a single word about them. People who painted on cave walls, built monuments, told stories around fires, and then vanished so completely that we do not even know what language they spoke. Tonight we will walk through 10 of those erasures. The pyramids of Egypt may exist because of one of them. The Mediterranean Sea was created by another. Civilization itself, every monument, every alphabet, every grain harvest, was built on top of layers of forgotten ruin. And the final entry on this list is the disaster that the International Commission on Stratigraphy formally designated in 2018 as the official boundary marker of the geological age we are currently living through. The age we live in is defined, scientifically and on paper, by the fact that it began when it stopped raining over an empire. Entry 10. The Zanclean Flood. 5.33 million years ago, before there were people, before there were modern humans, before there were even early hominids walking upright in the East African Rift Valley, there was a hole in the ground the size of Western Europe. 6 million years ago, the geological plates of Africa and Eurasia were grinding into each other along a fault that runs through what is now southern Spain and northern Morocco. The Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow gap between continents where the Atlantic now pours into the Mediterranean, had sealed shut. Tectonic uplift closed the gateway. Once the Atlantic was cut off, the basin behind it began to disappear. What happened next is called the Messinian salinity crisis, and it remains one of the strangest events in the planet's history. Cut off from oceanic resupply, surrounded by some of the most evaporation-prone latitudes on Earth, the Mediterranean simply began to dry out. The water went into the sky, salt precipitated out and settled. Layers of evaporate minerals built up across the basin floor, in some places hundreds of meters thick. The shoreline retreated and kept retreating. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the sea became a chain of hypersaline lagoons. Then it became salt flats. Then it became a near-empty depression. At the maximum drying, the deepest parts of the basin, the abyssal plain near what is now the southern coast of Sardinia, sat almost 5 kilometers below the level of the surrounding continental shelves. 5 kilometers of vertical drop, with nothing in between except baked salt, exposed sediment, and air so dense and so hot that anything resembling complex life would have been suffocated by the pressure and heat. Temperatures at the lowest points have been modelled at over 80 degrees Celsius during summer. The basin was not a sea. It was an inverted mountain range full of nothing. This continued for somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million years. The Mediterranean, as a body of water, did not exist. What existed in its place was an arid hellscape lower than Death Valley, by an order of magnitude, larger than the Sahara, ringed by mountains that would eventually become the coastlines of Italy, France, Spain, North Africa, Greece, Turkey, and the Levant. And then the wall holding back the Atlantic gave way. The geological evidence for what happened next is some of the most spectacular ever recovered from the seafloor. In December 2024, a research team led by Dr. Aaron McAuliffe published a study in Communications, Earth and Environment, based on detailed sub-seafloor surveys of the Sicily Sill, the underwater ridge between Sicily and North Africa, that the floodwaters had to overtop on their way east. What the team found, etched into the bedrock beneath the modern seabed, was a field of more than 300 elongated ridges, all aligned in the same direction, all consistent with erosion by a fluid moving at extraordinary speed. The estimated flow velocity, derived from the ridge dimensions and spacing, reached 32 metres per second. That is a sustained flow rate beyond anything documented in any modern river flood. Applied to a discharge so large it has no comparison in any other water event ever measured. The peak flow rate of the Zanclean megaflood has been estimated at between 68 and 100 million cubic metres of water per second, depending on the model used. The Amazon River, the largest river on Earth today, discharges around 200,000 cubic metres per second at its mouth. At its peak intensity, the Zanclean flood was several hundred times the volume of the Amazon, pushed through a corridor narrow enough to walk across in a single afternoon. In the words of the lead researcher, the Zanclean megaflood was an awe-inspiring natural phenomenon, with discharge rates and flow velocities dwarfing any other known flood in the planet's geological record. That's a scientist speaking in the careful, restrained language that scientists use. What it actually means is that the Atlantic Ocean came over the lip of the Gibraltar Barrier in a single coordinated cascade and filled an empty continent. Estimates for the speed of refilling vary depending on the modelling team and the assumptions used. The most aggressive models, supported by the New Ridge evidence, suggest the entire Mediterranean basin filled in somewhere between 2 and 16 years. During the peak of the inflow, water levels in the deepest sections of the basin would have risen by more than 10 metres per day. A shoreline could retreat backward, away from approaching water, faster than a person could walk. There is still an active scientific conversation about exactly how violent and how rapid the process was, with some researchers historically favouring a more gradual refilling over a longer span. Based on the physical evidence currently in hand, the erosional ridges, the carved spillover channel, the breccia deposits between the Messinian and Lower Zanclean sediments, the weight of the data appears to lean towards something extremely violent. The debate is not entirely closed. Both interpretations have been defended in the peer-reviewed literature. What is not in dispute is the outcome: a continent-sized depression filled with seawater, and the Mediterranean Sea, the body of water that would, millions of years later, define the entire arc of Western civilization, came into existence. There were no humans alive to see this. There would not be humans for 5 million years. There were no early hominids. The Australopithecines, our first identifiable ancestors, would not appear in the fossil record for another 2 million years after the flood. Whatever life existed in the surrounding terrain, fish, mollusks, terrestrial mammals near the shoreline, was either drowned, displaced, or simply rendered irrelevant by the new ocean overhead. The Mediterranean ecosystem we recognise today, with its endemic species and its trade route geography, and its long Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Egyptian history of human contact, did not yet exist in any form. It would be assembled slowly over the next several million years of geological and biological time. The reason this event belongs on this list is not because it ended a civilization. It ended a geography. The world that came before the Zanclean flood, that deep, dry, salt-encrusted hole between two continents, is gone in a way that no human eye ever saw and no human language can quite describe. The Phoenicians sailed across it without knowing it had ever been anything else. The Greeks colonised its shores. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, as if it had always been there for them. But it had not always been there. 5 1/3 million years ago, on a timescale that geology can resolve precisely, the Mediterranean came into existence in what may have been the most violent water event in the planet's entire history. The world we inherited, the trade routes, the coastlines, the entire stage on which classical civilization performed, was set by a catastrophe our species missed by an unimaginable margin. Every map of the Mediterranean ever drawn is a map of the aftermath. That is the first erasure. The land became the sea. A footnote worth keeping in mind as we continue. Most of the events on this list were unknown to science until the second half of the 20th century. The Zanclean flood was only definitively identified in the 1970s, and the strongest physical evidence for its violence was published in 2024. Doggerland was not properly mapped until 2007. The 4.2 kiloyear event was not formally designated as a geological boundary until 2018. The catalogue of catastrophes we're working through here is, in a real sense, still being assembled. Future research will almost certainly add to it, and may also revise the dates and severities of entries we currently think we understand. The version of this list that exists 50 years from now will not be identical to the one in your ears right now. Entry 9. The Toba super-eruption, 74,000 years ago. If you fly over the northern part of the Indonesian island of Sumatra and look down, you will see a long blue lake set into a high plateau. It's about 100 kilometres long and 30 kilometres wide, large enough to be visible from low Earth orbit. There is a smaller island sitting roughly in the centre of it. The lake is the largest volcanic lake on the planet. The island in the middle is the resurgent dome, the slow regrowth of the magma chamber underneath, pushing back up against the surface, building toward what will eventually be the next eruption. What you are looking at when you look at Lake Toba is the throat of one of the most violent volcanic events the Earth has produced in the entire span of human existence. The Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VE-MUS, is the standard scale used to measure eruption magnitude. It runs from 0 to 8. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, an event significant enough to flatten forests across hundreds of square kilometres, kill 57 people, and drop ash on cars in 3 states, was rated a 5. Krakatoa in 1883, the explosion you may have read about in history books, the one whose detonation was reportedly heard 4,000 kilometres away across the Indian Ocean, was a 6. Mount Tambora in 1815, which caused the famous year without a summer and led to crop failures across Europe and North America, was a 7. Toba, around 74,000 years ago, was an 8, the maximum classification on the scale. Each step on the VEI represents approximately a 10-fold increase in erupted volume. Toba was at least 1,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. The total ejected material is currently estimated at somewhere between 2,800 and 5,000 cubic kilometres, depending on whether one counts only the airfall ash or includes the enormous pyroclastic flow deposits that surround the caldera. The atmosphere over much of the planet was loaded with pulverised rock, ash, sulphur dioxide, pumice, and glass shards on a scale unmatched in the entire span of human evolution. Ash from the eruption has been found in marine sediment cores in the Indian Ocean. It has been recovered from cores in the South China Sea. It has been documented in lake sediments as far west as Lake Malawi in East Africa, more than 7,000 kilometres away from the source vent. Across the Indian subcontinent, geologists have identified an ash layer averaging around 5 centimetres thick across central and peninsular India, with localised deposits running up to 10 or 15 centimetres. Volcanic debris blanketing the entire region from the modern Pakistan border to the Bay of Bengal. The eruption did not just fill the sky over Indonesia, it fundamentally altered atmospheric conditions across an entire hemisphere. And this is where the human story enters. There is a peculiar fact about our species that geneticists have known for some time, and that population biologists find genuinely puzzling. The genetic diversity of all 8 billion people alive on Earth today is extraordinarily, almost suspiciously, low compared to other large mammals. Chimpanzees living in a single forest in Central Africa contain more genetic variation in their DNA than the entire current global human population. A few troops of chimps in Côte d'Ivoire are genetically more diverse than every person you have ever met combined. This is not normal. A species that has spread across every continent and has reached a population in the billions should, by every rule of population biology, contain enormous internal variation. We do not. Our DNA strongly suggests that at some point in our past, our entire breeding population was reduced to a very small number, and every modern human alive today descends from that small group of survivors. This is called a genetic bottleneck. In 1998, an anthropologist named Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois put forward a hypothesis. He argued that the bottleneck and the Toba eruption were the same event. The reasoning was straightforward. The eruption would have injected enormous quantities of sulphur dioxide and fine ash into the stratosphere. That material would have stayed aloft for years, blocking incoming solar radiation. Global temperatures would have dropped by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for a period of years, possibly decades. In higher latitudes, regional cooling may have reached 15 degrees. Some models suggest a full volcanic winter. Agriculture impossible, though there was no agriculture yet to disrupt, vegetation dying back across continents, food chains collapsing from the bottom up. For a human population that was still small to begin with, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers in Africa and the Middle East, totally dependent on local plant and animal availability, this would have been catastrophic. Ambrose's estimate was that the global human breeding population at the bottom of the bottleneck may have fallen to between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Every person alive today, on this hypothesis, descends from a population small enough to fit inside a single modern sports stadium. We are, in this view, the descendants of a few thousand survivors of a single Indonesian volcano. The hypothesis is contested, it has to be said clearly. More recent archaeological work, particularly at sites in southern India, where artefacts have been recovered both above and below the Toba ash layer, has shown that some human populations apparently continued making and using the same kinds of tools through the eruption. Not all the genetic evidence aligns perfectly with the Toba timing either. A 2018 study in South Africa found stone tool industries that seem to have persisted across the eruption, with no obvious disruption at all. There are researchers who now argue the Toba climate effect was milder than originally proposed, and that the bottleneck has a different cause. Perhaps a series of smaller events, perhaps natural population fluctuations, perhaps something else entirely. What is not contested is the eruption itself. The volcano detonated. Thousands of cubic kilometres of material went up. Hemispheric ash deposition is in the rock record. Sulfur dioxide injections at that scale have known atmospheric consequences. And something, perhaps Toba, perhaps not, but something, did push our entire species through a population bottleneck so severe it still shows up in our DNA 70,000 years later. The eruption left a calling card you can stand on. The northern lobe of Lake Toba sits inside the original caldera, which collapsed in on itself when the magma chamber emptied. The surrounding plateau is built almost entirely of welded tuff, pyroclastic flows that solidified into rock when the eruption ended. The local Badak people have lived on that plateau for centuries. They farm the land, they fish in the lake. Beneath their feet, in solid form, is the largest volcanic event in our species' history. They are walking on the ash of the catastrophe that may have nearly ended us. Whether or not Toba was the direct cause of the bottleneck, the eruption is real, the ash is real, the scale is staggering, and the question of how close our ancestors came to extinction is one that the genetic record refuses to let go of. We are, at minimum, a species that came very close to disappearing at some point in our deep past, and whatever did it, the marks are still there, written into every cell of every person reading or hearing this script. Consider for a moment what survival through a volcanic winter at this scale would have actually looked like for the human bands that made it through. Their hunting grounds altered overnight. Familiar plants no longer producing edible fruits or seeds at familiar times. Migration patterns of large game disrupted as the animals themselves moved to track shifting vegetation zones. Water sources possibly contaminated by ash fall for weeks or months. Skies dim enough during peak ash loading that, even at midday, the sun would have appeared as a weak red disk behind a permanent haze. For a population already small and already operating at the margin of what a forager economy can support, even a modest reduction in carrying capacity would translate into mass mortality across the band level. Children would die first. Elders, who carry the accumulated practical knowledge that hunter-gatherer societies depend on, would die second. The tool-making traditions, the seasonal calendars, the medicinal plant knowledge, the burial practices, the names for everything in the surrounding landscape. All of that lived in the heads of specific people, and when those people died young and unexpectedly, what they knew died with them. Even the survivors of a population crash do not preserve the full cultural inheritance of the population that died around them. They preserve fragments, the parts they happen to know, the techniques they happen to have already learned by the time their teachers were lost. If Toba did push our species through a bottleneck of 3,000 to 10,000 individuals, what survived was not just genetic. It was a curated, incomplete subset of everything that human bands across Africa and Asia and the Levant had developed during the preceding 150,000 years. We are descendants of a filter event. Most of what came before us, culturally and behaviourally, did not make it through. That is the second erasure. We almost went out completely. Most of us never came back. Entry 8. The flooding of Doggerland 8,000 to 5,500 years ago. There is a region of the floor of the North Sea, between the eastern coast of England and the western coast of the Netherlands, where fishing trawlers occasionally pull up something that does not belong in a fishing net. Mammoth tusks, stone tools, pieces of carved bone, a barbed antler harpoon, fully fashioned and dating to somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 years ago. In one famous case in 1931, a trawler called the Kalinda dredged up a complete worked antler point from a depth where no antler should ever have been. The discovery confirmed something that geologists had already suspected from the seabed contours. The North Sea, in its current form, is younger than human civilization, and it used to be land. During the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, so much of the world's water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea levels were approximately 120 metres lower than they are today. The English Channel did not exist. Britain was not an island. The shallow continental shelf that now lies beneath the North Sea was instead an enormous lowland plain, stretching from what is now eastern England all the way across to Denmark, the Netherlands and northern Germany. This place has a name now. Archaeologists call it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow ridge in the middle of the modern North Sea, where the highest hills of the Lost Country once stood. It was not a wasteland. It was not a frozen tundra crossed only by passing migrations. By the early Holocene, as the ice retreated and the climate warmed, Doggerland was one of the most productive places in northern Europe. Salt marshes along its coasts, reed beds in its river deltas, forested uplands, lakes, estuaries, game in extraordinary abundance, red deer, aurochs, wild boar, beaver, salmon, sturgeon. Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities lived here for thousands of years, working flint, fishing the rivers, building seasonal camps, raising children, burying their dead. In 2007, an archaeologist named Vince Gaffney at the University of Birmingham did something that fundamentally changed how this lost world was understood. He obtained access to oil and gas industry seismic survey data, the same three-dimensional seabed scans that energy companies use to find petroleum deposits, and used them to reconstruct the topography of Doggerland in detail. What emerged from that data was a map of a country. Major rivers, including a now-vanished tributary system that flowed northeast from what is now the Wash into a large freshwater basin in the central North Sea. Estuaries, marshes, hills with names in the modern reconstruction, like the Dogger Hills and the Outer Silver Pit. A territory roughly the size of modern Britain itself, fully mapped, fully imaginable, and entirely underwater. What did the people of Doggerland look like? We have several extraordinary clues. From dredged material off the Zealand coast of the Netherlands, a fragment of a young male Neanderthal's skull has been recovered, dated to at least 40,000 years ago. Off the East Anglian coast, a separate collection of Neanderthal stone tools and animal remains has been pulled from the seabed by oil industry dredgers and offshore aggregate operations. Together, these finds indicate that the broader region had been occupied by archaic humans long before the modern population arrived. Modern human artifacts found across the wider area include flint blades and microliths consistent with Mesolithic toolkits, known from confirmed mainland sites in Denmark and northern Germany. A hand axe with a date estimate around 50,000 years ago has also been recovered. Whatever Doggerland was, it had been continuously inhabited, across multiple human species, for tens of thousands of years before the water came. The drowning was not a single event. It was a process that lasted thousands of years, and that the people inside it experienced as a slow, ongoing emergency. Beginning around 8,500 BC, as the great ice sheets continued to melt and sea levels rose, the edges of Doggerland began to fail first. Low coastal areas flooded. Salt marshes turned permanently salty. River mouths backed up. Communities living at the margins moved inland, generation by generation, as the world they knew got smaller. The pace was not even. There were periods of rapid sea level rise and periods of relative stability. But the overall direction was one way only. The land was getting smaller. The water was getting closer. By around 6,500 BC, Doggerland had been reduced to an archipelago. The highest ground, the Dogger Bank, still stood as a substantial island, possibly comparable in size to modern Sicily. Smaller islands dotted what had become a partially flooded shallow sea. The communities still living on these islands had been there for generations. Their ancestors had lived on a continent. Now they lived on shrinking territory, surrounded on every side by water that had been forest within human memory. In recent years, Bradford University's Lost Frontiers project has produced detailed computational reconstructions of the entire drowning process, mapping the flooding across approximately 15,000 years and showing something striking. The process was not always gradual. There were tipping points, moments when the rising sea breached natural barriers and ate large amounts of land in single events. The slow drowning of a continent was punctuated by sudden geographic losses that the people watching them must have understood as disasters in their own right. What was lost is incalculable. An entire continent's worth of human history, potentially spanning 5,000 years of continuous habitation. The language those people spoke is gone. We do not have a single word of it. The names they gave to their rivers, their hills, their settlements, their gods, their dead. All gone. The oral traditions, the burial customs, the cosmological stories about how the world began, their understanding of the landscape, generations of accumulated knowledge about which marshes flooded when, which game migrated where, which plants were edible in which seasons, all swallowed by the ocean. We can sketch, in faint outline, what their lives might have looked like in better times. Mesolithic communities along the coastlines and river deltas of northern Europe lived in small, semi-permanent settlements, often returning to the same locations for generations and centuries. They built shelters of timber and hide. They processed fish in such quantities that some of their shell middens, the accumulated heaps of discarded mollusk shells and food refuse, are still visible today as significant landscape features on coasts that have not yet been drowned. They wove fishing nets from plant fibres. They hunted with composite weapons, combining wooden shafts with finely worked stone blades. They made art. From sites in Denmark and northern Germany, contemporaneous with the last days of Doggerland, archaeologists have recovered amber pendants, decorated antler tools, and carved bone figurines whose stylistic conventions suggest a shared regional artistic tradition that almost certainly extended westward across the now-drowned territory. The Doggerland people were, in other words, exactly like the people whose remains we have recovered from the surrounding still-dry coastlines. Sophisticated, mobile, well-adapted to coastal and wetland environments, embedded in networks of trade and cultural exchange that we can partly reconstruct from the artefacts those networks left, scattered along the surviving margins. The difference is only that their version of the same culture happened to live on territory that no longer exists. Their cemeteries are at the bottom of the North Sea. Their seasonal camps are submerged. The places where they buried their grandparents, and the places where they ground their grain, and the places where they built their final winter shelters before the water came over the doorway. All underwater, all silent, all waiting. And the drowning, when it ended, did not end gently. The final blow to what remained of Doggerland came from the north, and it was not the slow rise of the sea that delivered it. It was a single violent event, 300 kilometres off the Norwegian coast, that produced a wave the survivors on the remaining islands almost certainly could not have outrun. That event is the next entry on this list, and it is one of the most underrated catastrophes in the entire archaeological record. Most documentaries about lost worlds skip it entirely. We will not. That is the third erasure, a continent's worth of forgotten history, still down there, still being slowly recovered from beneath the North Sea floor. Entry 7. The Storegga slide 8,150 years ago. About 300 kilometres off the western coast of Norway, in a section of the Norwegian continental shelf that geologists now call the Storegga area. The name means the Great Edge in Norwegian. Something failed beneath the ocean approximately 8,150 years ago. What failed was not a small failure. A block of seabed roughly 300 kilometres long, 50 kilometres wide and several hundred metres thick, an area of solid sediment about the size of Scotland, broke loose from the continental shelf and slid down into the deep ocean. The volume of material involved is staggering. An estimated 3,500 cubic kilometres of sediment moved in this single event. To put that in some kind of perspective, the entire freshwater volume of all 5 Great Lakes of North America combined is approximately 22,000 cubic kilometres. The Storegga slide moved roughly 1/6 of that volume. but as solid sediment, not water, and in a matter of minutes rather than across millions of years of geological time, it remains one of the largest known submarine landslides ever recorded in the Earth's geological history. What triggered it is still being investigated. The most widely accepted explanation involves a combination of factors that aligned in a specific window. Accumulated post-glacial sediment loading, the destabilizing release of gas hydrates as ocean temperatures shifted, and possibly seismic activity from the rebounding Scandinavian landmass as it rose back up after being pressed down by the weight of the recently melted ice sheet. The slope failed because the conditions for stability had drifted just past a critical threshold. The seabed gave way. Submarine landslides of this magnitude do not announce themselves. There is no atmospheric warning, no earthquake powerful enough that people living on distant coastlines would have felt it through their feet. The trigger may have been imperceptible to anyone not directly above it. What happened next was not. When that much sediment displaces that much water, that quickly, the result is a tsunami. Not a wave in the ordinary sense, a wave train. A series of pulses of displaced water moved outward across the North Atlantic in every direction, travelling at the speed of a commercial jet aircraft. Modern modelling, calibrated against the actual deposit record, suggests the first wave reached the Shetland Islands within approximately 3 hours of the initial slide. The geological evidence for what happened when those waves hit land is extraordinary, and it is preserved across the coastlines of northern Europe. On the Shetland Islands, north of mainland Scotland, sediment scientists have traced wave deposits to elevations of more than 20 metres above the sea level of the time, sand and marine debris lifted to that height by water. Along the northeast coast of Scotland, tsunami deposits register at elevations of around 3 to 6 metres above contemporary sea level. Those sand layers from the event have been traced as far as roughly 80 kilometres inland in places where the wave funnelled up estuaries, implying that the wave's reach was extensive even where its run-up height was modest. On the Norwegian coast itself, the side facing the slide directly, peer-reviewed reconstructions estimate tsunami deposits at elevations of roughly 10 to 12 metres above the sea level of the time, with some modelling suggesting locally higher run-up where bays and fjords funnelled the wave. The deposits are recorded in coastal peat bogs across western Norway, where a layer of marine sand and shells sits abruptly between layers of terrestrial vegetation, marking the moment when the ocean came up over the land and then receded, leaving its calling card behind in stratified form. In 2020, the Lost Frontiers research team, based at the University of Bradford and led by Vince Gaffney, published in the journal Geosciences the first confirmed direct evidence of the Storegga tsunami recovered from the southern North Sea itself. Sediment cores taken from a submerged Paleo River channel in the area, once part of central Doggerland, contained tsunami-like deposits of clastic sediments, stones, and broken shells sandwiched between laminar estuarine layers. Multiproxy analysis, including sedimentary ancient DNA, revealed that after the wave passed, the local landscape did not immediately disappear underwater. The remnant terrain showed signs of being grazed by bears, wild boar, and ruminants in the period that followed. The interpretation that has emerged from this evidence is striking. The tsunami did considerable damage where it struck directly, but the broader landscape of the southern North Sea persisted afterward, and the final submergence of these areas came later, as the slowly rising sea finally consumed what was left. Now, the connection that ties this entry to the previous one. By the time the Storegga wave arrived, Doggerland had already been drowning for thousands of years. What remained of it was a low-lying archipelago of islands and shallows, the highest ground sitting perhaps 30 or 40 metres above the surrounding sea. Whether substantial human populations were still living on these last islands is a question the archaeological record cannot yet answer with certainty. The seabed has been worked over by currents and trawlers for 8,000 years, and the Lost Frontiers sediment cores from the tsunami zone found no direct evidence of human occupation at the specific location sampled. Based on what we know about Mesolithic coastal occupation patterns elsewhere in northern Europe at this period, it is at least reasonable to assume that small communities continued to use the remaining islands, but the direct proof has not yet been recovered. Imagine, for any people who were there, the geometry of what happened. You're standing on a low coastal flat, perhaps 2 or 3 metres above the tide. You see far out on the horizon the sea begin to do something it has never done before. It withdraws. The tide line retreats out beyond the limit of vision. Fish flop on freshly exposed mud. Whatever survival instincts a 30,000-year cultural memory of coastlines has produced You have those instincts. You do not have a word for tsunami. You do not have a written record of any previous one. You're looking at something your grandfather's grandfather never saw and never described. Then it returns, not as a tide, as a wall. For the inhabitants of what remained of Doggerland, if there were any in the affected areas, there was little high ground. The slow drowning of their continent had eliminated the mountains and the hills. What was left was flat and low. A wave of that magnitude crossing a place whose highest natural elevation was perhaps a few tens of meters above sea level would have moved across it in minutes, lifting and breaking and moving everything in its path. Anyone alive in the direct impact zone almost certainly did not survive. It is important to be precise about cause and effect here. The Storegga slide did not erase Doggerland. The rising seas did that slowly over thousands of years. The current weight of evidence, particularly from the Lost Frontiers sediment cores, suggests that even after the tsunami, much of the landscape persisted for some time before final inundation. The wave was severe. It was not, as was once thought, the single moment of Doggerland's end. The end came later, and it came quietly. The same slow rise that had been working on the territory for millennia, finally finishing the job. That is the fourth erasure. A continent that drowned by inches, with a single afternoon of catastrophe written into the middle of the long ending. Entry 6. The Black Sea Deluge, 7,600 years ago. Somewhere down in the cold, almost completely oxygen-free deep water of the modern Black Sea, more than 150 meters below the surface, the bones of a freshwater lake are preserved in conditions that should not exist anywhere else on Earth. Wooden structures, tool fragments, shells of mollusks that cannot survive in salt water and have not lived in this basin for more than 7,000 years. A complete fossil shoreline, intact, undisturbed, sitting at a depth where the modern Black Sea is salt and the modern world has long since forgotten that any of this was ever above water. The Black Sea, in its current form, is approximately 7,600 years old. Before that, it was something else. In 1997, two geologists at Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed a hypothesis that would become one of the most discussed and most contested theories in late 20th century Earth science. Their argument, supported by sediment cores, sonar surveys and radiocarbon dating, was that the modern Black Sea was created by a sudden and catastrophic flood that broke through the natural land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait and poured salt water from the Mediterranean into what had been for tens of thousands of years a much smaller, much lower freshwater lake. The mechanics of their proposed event were extreme. The pre-deluge lake sat approximately 150 meters below modern sea level. As global sea levels continued to rise after the end of the last ice age, the Mediterranean climbed steadily higher relative to the Black Sea basin. The rising Mediterranean topped the natural sill at the Bosphorus and began to spill over. Once the spillover began, erosion of the narrow channel accelerated dramatically. The trickle became a cascade. The cascade became a roar. At peak flow, according to Ryan and Pittman's modelling, the Bosphorus deluge would have been moving approximately 200 times the discharge of Niagara Falls. The lake's surface rose by as much as 15 centimetres per day in the early phases of the flood. The flat northern shorelines, which sloped only gently up from the water's edge, retreated at rates exceeding a kilometre per day. Within months, an area of fertile lowland roughly the size of modern Ireland was submerged. Within years, the entire lake had risen by over 100 metres, salinity had reversed completely, and the freshwater ecosystem that had existed in the basin for millennia was dead. The evidence for the deluge accumulated steadily through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Sonar surveys produced clear images of ancient drowned shorelines at the predicted depths. Sediment cores from the modern seabed showed an abrupt, knife-sharp transition from freshwater deposits below to marine deposits above, exactly the kind of stratigraphic boundary you would expect from a rapid replacement of one water type with another. Below the boundary, the sediment contained freshwater mollusk shells and pollen consistent with a temperate inland lake. Above the boundary, marine species appeared suddenly and completely, with no transitional layer in between. Then, in 2000, Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had previously located the wreck of the Titanic, turned his attention to the Black Sea. Using deep-sea remotely operated vehicles, Ballard's team began surveying the ancient shoreline at depth. What they reported was remarkable. Wooden structures, possibly the remains of human-built habitations preserved in the anoxic deep water where normal decomposition cannot occur. The Black Sea has an unusual chemistry. Below about 150 metres, the water contains almost no dissolved oxygen, the deep currents are minimal, and organic material does not decay in the normal way. Wood that would have rotted into mud millennia ago in any other body of water can survive structurally intact for thousands of years in the Black Sea's deep darkness. What this means is sobering. The submerged shoreline of the pre-deluge lake is, in effect, an enormous archaeological preserve. It has barely been explored. Most of what is down there has never been touched by modern science. Whatever communities lived on the old shore, whatever they built, whatever they left behind in the final weeks and days before the water rose, much of it may still be there, waiting. There is, as with the Zanclean flood, an ongoing scientific debate about the speed and severity of the deluge. Some geologists, particularly a research group in Bulgaria and Turkey, have argued that the flooding was more gradual than Ryan and Pittman proposed. In their alternative model, the Black Sea filled over several thousand years rather than several months. The fundamental event is not disputed. The Black Sea was once a smaller, lower, fresher body and became a larger, higher, salt one. But the timescale and severity remain subjects of active investigation. Both positions are still defended in current peer-reviewed publications. The truth may lie somewhere between the two extremes. What is not in dispute is that people lived on the old shoreline, the lowlands surrounding a freshwater lake in a semi-arid region, with reliable annual precipitation and rich alluvial soils, would have been some of the most desirable agricultural territory in all of Neolithic Eurasia. The communities living there were not nomadic hunter-gatherers passing through. They were among the earliest farmers in the world. They cultivated wheat and barley. They raised sheep and goats. They built permanent structures and accumulated material possessions. They buried their dead with grave goods. Then, depending on which model you accept, the water came either as a flood that drowned them within a season, or as a slow rise that displaced them across generations. Either way, it took everything: their fields, their settlements, their burial grounds. Whatever oral traditions they had been accumulating about the geography around them, whatever names they had given to the rivers and hills now beneath the modern Black Sea, all of it lost. There is a fascinating cultural footnote to this entry, and it is worth raising with care. Across the broader region, through Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, the Caucasus, almost every ancient mythology from this part of the world contains a flood story. The Epic of Gilgamesh has one, the Book of Genesis has one, the Greek myth of Deucalion has one, the Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic has one. They are not identical, but they share remarkable structural similarities. A human community is destroyed by rising water. A few survivors escape. The world afterward is fundamentally different from the world before. Some researchers have argued, and the argument remains controversial, that these flood myths may preserve, in highly mythologized and theologically reframed form, the cultural memory of the Black Sea deluge. The reasoning is that the communities displaced by the rising water would have scattered across the surrounding region, carrying their stories with them. Over generations, those stories could have been reworked, embellished, attached to local deities, transformed eventually into religious texts. This reading is impossible to prove directly, but the geographic and chronological alignment is striking enough that it has been seriously discussed in the academic literature. Whether the world's most enduring flood story originated in the Black Sea or somewhere else, the fact remains that a flood at roughly this scale and roughly this timing did genuinely happen. The mechanism by which oral memory can preserve a real event across thousands of years has been studied in other contexts, and the results are surprisingly relevant here. Australian Aboriginal communities along the northern coast preserve specific oral traditions describing the coastline as it existed before the post-glacial sea level rise, including the locations of islands and landmarks now submerged. A 2016 study by Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reid in the journal Australian Geographer compared 21 of these stories against bathymetric reconstructions of post-glacial sea level rise around Australia. The minimum age of the events described, derived from the depth of the now submerged features the stories refer to, fell between roughly 7,000 and 13,000 years before present. Based on this analysis, the authors argued that it is at least demonstrably possible for human cultures to preserve accurate descriptions of geographic features across hundreds of generations of oral transmission. Whether the Mesopotamian and Hebrew and Greek flood traditions actually do preserve a memory of the Black Sea event specifically, or of some other regional flood, or of a composite of multiple events, is a question that may never be resolvable with certainty. But the underlying possibility of long-term cultural memory of real geological events is, on the evidence, not fanciful. What this means for any honest reading of ancient mythology is that the flood stories should not be dismissed as pure invention. They may be invention. They may also be highly transformed historical record. The geologists who study the Black Sea, the linguists who study the diffusion of myth, and the archaeologists who study the now submerged Neolithic shoreline are all working different angles of the same fundamentally unsettled question. The flood happened. People lived through it, or escaped it, or died in it. The stories may be theirs. That is the fifth erasure, an entire shoreline of early agricultural Europe now sitting in oxygen-free darkness, waiting to be found. Entry 5. The Younger Dryas 12,800 years ago returned for a moment to the mammoths in the Siberian ice, the ones with buttercups still in their stomachs. Those animals did not die slowly, they did not starve, they did not get sick. The leading scientific explanation, based on the broken bones and suffocation signatures found in several recovered specimens, is that they fell into crevasses or were caught in collapsing banks of frozen mud, and were buried so rapidly in cold sediment that the wildflowers in their guts never had time to break down. The preservation does not require an instantaneous hemispheric flash freeze of the open air, as some older popular accounts proposed. What it does require is a Pleistocene environment that was structurally different from anything you would find on the modern Siberian steppe, a place where large animals routinely grazed in latitudes and ecosystems that no longer support them, ending up frozen into ground that has now held them for tens of thousands of years. And that environment did not last. Around the time those mammoths were grazing, the Earth was lurching out of the last ice age and into the climate of the modern Holocene. The transition was not smooth. At one point in the middle of it, the warming stopped and reversed. The reversal is one of the most studied climate events in the entire Pleistocene-Holocene record, and it has a name. It is called the Younger Dryas, after a small alpine flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in northern European sediment layers at exactly this period, indicating a sudden cold climate vegetation regime replacing the warmer forests that had been spreading northward as the Ice Age waned. The setup is important. By 13,000 years ago, the world was warming. The great Pleistocene ice sheets were retreating. Sea levels were rising as glacial meltwater fed back into the oceans. Temperate forests were recolonizing latitudes that had been tundra a few thousand years earlier. Megafauna populations across Eurasia and the Americas were under pressure from a combination of climate change and the spreading human population, but many species were still hanging on. North America still had mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, giant beavers, and a megafauna assemblage that would have looked, to a modern eye, like the African savanna on steroids. Then, within years, possibly within a single year in the most rapidly responding records, according to some Greenland ice core data, the warming stopped and reversed. Temperatures in Greenland fell by approximately 10 degrees Celsius. The North Atlantic froze further south than it had in millennia. The cold reached deep into Europe, into North Africa, into the Levant and across to North America. Vegetation zones snapped backward. Forests died. Open tundra returned to areas that had been temperate forest within a single human lifetime. And during this period, in North America, something happened to the megafauna that biologists and paleontologists are still trying to fully explain. 35 genera of large mammals vanished from the continent within a few thousand years, bracketing the Younger Dryas. Mammoths, mastodons, glyptodonts, dire wolves, short-faced bears, camels. Yes, camels evolved in North America before going extinct on their home continent and surviving only as dispersed descendants in Asia and South America. Horses, similarly, evolved in North America and went extinct there during this period, surviving only in Eurasian populations that would not return to the Americas until the Spanish brought them back 15,000 years later. At the same time, the Clovis culture, the earliest widely confirmed and widely distributed human culture in the Americas, named for the distinctive fluted spear points first identified in Clovis, New Mexico, disappeared from the archaeological record. The same tool-making tradition that had spread across the continent over the previous several hundred years simply stopped. What replaced it was a fragmented set of regional cultures, smaller in scale, different in technology, possibly representing remnant populations adapting to a world that no longer contained the megafauna they had previously hunted. This is a triple coincidence in time. The climate crashed, the megafauna died, the leading human culture vanished, all within the same approximate window. The Younger Dryas itself lasted roughly 1,200 years. Then it ended. And the ending was, if anything, even more abrupt than the beginning. Ice core records from Greenland suggest that the climate transitioned from full Younger Dryas cold to full Holocene warm in as little as 40 to 50 years. A generation that had spent its childhood shivering through bitter winters could have lived to see its grandchildren growing up in a climate roughly comparable to today's. That kind of climatic whiplash, at the scale of an entire hemisphere, is not normal. It is one of the most extreme climate transitions in the entire Pleistocene-Holocene record. What caused it? Two leading explanations remain in active scientific debate after nearly 2 decades of investigation. The first is the meltwater pulse hypothesis. As the North American ice sheet retreated, an enormous proglacial lake, Lake Agassiz, formed along its southern margin. Lake Agassiz at its maximum extent was larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, holding an estimated 163,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water. It was dammed by ice. When the ice gave way, the lake drained. The freshwater pulse poured into the North Atlantic, disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great oceanic conveyor belt that distributes heat from the tropics to the northern high latitudes, and plunged the northern hemisphere back toward glacial conditions almost overnight. This hypothesis is well supported by ice core, marine sediment, and continental geological evidence. The second is the comet impact hypothesis. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing that a fragmenting comet, or cluster of cometary debris, struck the northern hemisphere at approximately the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Their evidence consisted of an unusual sediment layer found at multiple archaeological sites, said to contain nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds proposed to form under shock pressures consistent with impact events, along with melt glass, exotic microspherules, and platinum anomalies suggesting extraterrestrial material. The impact hypothesis has been controversial since the day it was published, and the mainstream scientific reception has, on balance, been skeptical. A 2010 study led by paleobotanist Andrew C. Scott proposed that some of the carbon spherules originally identified as impact markers were actually fossilized fungi or insect fecal pellets. A separate analysis by geophysicist J. Melosh argued that an airburst event of the kind proposed could not generate the pressures necessary to produce nanodiamonds in the first place. Comprehensive review papers published in the years since, including a major 2023 refutation from a team at the University of Arizona, have argued that no known impact crater dates to the Younger Dryas onset, that the supposed impact markers can be explained by ordinary terrestrial processes, and that the chronology of the proposed impact layer is too imprecise to support a single global event. Proponents of the hypothesis continue to defend it. The body of physical evidence at Younger Dryas boundary sites remains contested. What can be said with confidence is that the impact hypothesis is, at present, a minority position within the relevant scientific community, and that the meltwater pulse mechanism remains the more widely accepted explanation for the climate reversal itself. What is established is the timing. Whatever caused the Younger Dryas, it began suddenly, lasted approximately 12 centuries, ended even more suddenly, and coincided with the disappearance of the dominant human culture in the Americas and the extinction of dozens of large mammal species across the same continent. And one more thing. Almost exactly as the Younger Dryas ended, in southeastern Anatolia, on a hill that the modern Turkish locals call Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, construction began on a series of monumental stone structures that should not, by every model of prehistoric human development that existed before their discovery, have been possible. T-shaped limestone pillars up to 5.5 meters tall, some weighing as much as 20 tons, arranged in interlocking circles, carved with detailed reliefs of animals, foxes, scorpions, snakes, vultures, lions, wild boars, 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, built, according to the conventional archaeological timeline of the region, by people who had not yet invented agriculture, by hunter-gatherers. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe, beginning with the first excavations by Klaus Schmidt in 1995, fundamentally rewrote what we thought we knew about the cognitive and organisational capacity of late Pleistocene humans. How does a society of hunter-gatherers, in the immediate aftermath of a 1200-year climate catastrophe, organise the labour and the knowledge required to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton carved monoliths? Why did they do it? What did the carvings mean? Were they responding to something, the memory of the cold years, the loss of the megafauna, the trauma of the climate event itself, that needed to be commemorated in stone? We do not know. The site was deliberately buried by the people who built it, sometime around 8000 BC. They buried their own monument. We have no idea why. What we can say is this: Göbekli Tepe and a small handful of related sites in southeastern Anatolia, Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and several others now under active excavation, form a regional architectural tradition that predates every other known monumental construction site on Earth. The Egyptian pyramids are 7,000 years younger. Stonehenge is also 7,000 years younger. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are 6,000 years younger. The Olmec heads in Mexico are 8,000 years younger. There is no continuous architectural tradition connecting Göbekli Tepe forward to any of these later monumental sites. It is at present an island in time, a sophisticated stone construction tradition that appeared in the immediate post-Younger Dryas period, lasted approximately 1,500 years, and then disappeared. The carvings on the pillars include detailed reliefs that strongly suggest a pre-agricultural worldview. The animals depicted are wild, not domesticated. Wild boars, wild aurochs, foxes, leopards, vultures. There are no sheep, no goats, no cattle in the typical post-domestication forms. This is consistent with a population that had not yet committed to farming. But the labour required to construct the site is consistent with a population that had committed to a settled, organised, hierarchical mode of social existence that had previously been thought to require farming. Something other than agriculture, in other words, was holding the construction crews in place long enough to do the work. The most discussed hypothesis is that what held them in place was the construction itself. The proposal goes like this: Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites could be read as evidence of a religious or ritual organisational impulse so powerful that it preceded and possibly catalysed the agricultural revolution rather than following from it. People came together to build the monuments. The monuments required them to stay. Staying in one place could imply the need to develop new food strategies. The food strategies, in time, became agriculture. This sequence, religion first, agriculture second, is the reverse of what most 20th century theories of cultural evolution had predicted. Whether it is the correct interpretation remains contested among archaeologists working in the region. What is not disputed is that the discovery of Göbekli Tepe has forced an ongoing reconsideration of what kind of motivation can drive humans to fundamentally restructure their way of life. And the timing matters. Why now? Why specifically in the immediate aftermath of the Younger Dryas? There is no consensus answer. Based on what we know about the period, we can at least observe that a population that had just experienced 1,200 years of climatic instability, watched the megafauna disappear, and emerged into an abruptly warming world would have had plenty of psychological material to work with. The Göbekli Tepe carvings are not random. They depict specific scenes: vultures carrying severed heads, scorpions, headless human figures. They look, on one possible reading, like memorial images. Memorials to what, we cannot say. That is the sixth erasure. A climate catastrophe, the disappearance of the first North American culture, the extinction of a continent's megafauna, and the unexplained sudden appearance of monumental architecture in Anatolia, all bracketing the same 1,200-year window in human prehistory. Entry 4. The collapse of the Green Sahara 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. If you took an airplane today across the Central Sahara, from the western coast of Mauritania to the Red Sea, you would fly over more than 4,000 kilometres of one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Sand seas, stone deserts, eroded plateaus. Annual rainfall in much of this region is less than 25 millimetres per year. In some places it does not rain for years at a time. The temperatures during the day routinely exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The place is, by any reasonable measure, dead. 8,000 years ago, you would have flown over savanna grasslands, riverine forests, and at the geographic centre of what is now the Bilma Erg, you would have looked down on a freshwater lake larger than Germany. The Sahara was green. It is the kind of statement that sounds metaphorical or exaggerated when you first hear it, but it is not. The pollen record, the lake sediment cores, the fossil pollen samples, the bone deposits, the rock art. Every independent line of evidence converges on the same conclusion. During the African humid period, roughly from 12,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was a productive, biodiverse, well-watered place supporting some of the largest concentrations of wildlife on the planet. The centrepiece of the Green Sahara was a body of water now called Lake Megachad, the ancient precursor to the modern Lake Chad. At its maximum extent, approximately 7,000 years ago, Megachad covered an estimated 400,000 square kilometres. That is larger than the modern Caspian Sea, larger than the modern Great Lakes combined. A freshwater inland sea sitting in the middle of what is now one of the most arid places on Earth. The ancient shorelines of Megachad are still visible in satellite imagery, long, perfectly preserved beach ridges running across hundreds of kilometres of empty desert, marking sea levels from a world that has been gone for thousands of years. The wildlife was extraordinary. Hippopotamuses lived throughout the central Sahara. Crocodiles inhabited the rivers and lakes. Giraffes browsed in the woodlands. Elephants migrated across what is now bare rock and sand. Lions hunted gazelles and antelopes in the grass. Across the Tassili Naja plateau in modern Algeria, in dozens of separate cave and shelter sites, ancient peoples painted what they saw. The rock art shows cattle herders driving their stock across grasslands. Hunters with bows in pursuit of large game, dancers, swimmers, actual swimmers, in a painting now known as the Swimmers in a cave in southwestern Egypt, depicting people in postures clearly indicative of swimming in open water. In a part of the Sahara that today receives less rain than the surface of Mars, people lived in the Sahara, not as nomadic herders passing through, but as residents of an inhabited place. The archaeological evidence shows fishing camps along ancient lake shores, cattle pastoralism throughout the central plateaus, possible early experiments in agriculture in the wetter eastern regions. The population of the Green Sahara across its full extent has been estimated conservatively in the millions. This was not a marginal frontier. This was, for several thousand years, one of the most populous regions of the African continent. And then, beginning around 5000 BC, the world they lived in started to die. The cause was astronomical at its root. The Earth's axial tilt and its orbital precession, slow, regular variations in the geometry of the planet's relationship to the Sun, were gradually shifting the strength and northern reach of the West African monsoon. The same forces that had earlier driven the African humid period now began to reverse it. The monsoon belt retreated southward. Annual rainfall in the central Sahara began to decline. If this had been a purely astronomical effect, the drying would have been very slow, a slight reduction in precipitation each decade, almost imperceptible across human generations. But climate models suggest that the system contained tipping points. As rainfall declined, vegetation began to die back. As vegetation died back, the land surface reflected more sunlight, absorbed less heat, and contributed less moisture to the atmosphere through transpiration. Reduced atmospheric moisture meant reduced rainfall. Reduced rainfall meant more vegetation loss. A feedback loop accelerated the drying far beyond what orbital forcing alone would have predicted. In 2008, the paleoclimatologist Stefan Kropelin published a key study in Science based on sediment cores from Lake Yoa in northern Chad, one of the few remaining lakes in the modern eastern Sahara, preserved because it is fed by deep groundwater that has been slowly leaking from the underlying aquifers for thousands of years. Kropelin's cores recorded the entire transition from Green Sahara to full desert in continuous year-by-year resolution. What they showed was a slow and progressive drying that played out across roughly 6,000 years overall, with the most rapid phase of vegetation collapse, the window when open grass savanna gave way to Sahel-type vegetation, and the lake itself transitioned from fresh to saline, unfolding inside that broader trajectory across approximately 1,000 to 2,000 years. Slow enough that each generation might have inherited a world only slightly drier than the one before, fast enough that the cumulative change across 50 generations was the difference between a savanna and a sand sea. Lake Megachad dried out, Today's Lake Chad covers roughly 1,500 square kilometres, less than 0.5% of the area of its ancient precursor. The cattle herders moved south, into the still-watered Sahel and into the forests of West Africa. The fishing communities moved east. The hunters followed the game wherever it went. Whole linguistic and cultural traditions, built around places that no longer existed, fragmented and reformed, and were carried into new territories where they would mix with the populations already living there. But the migration that mattered most for the history of human civilization was the one that headed east, into the only place left in the region with a permanent and reliable water supply, the Nile Valley. This is where the story takes a remarkable turn. The Egyptologist Fakhri Hassan at University College London, along with a number of other researchers working on the desertification of the Sahara, has proposed that the influx of Saharan refugees into the Nile corridor during the late stages of the green-to-desert transition fundamentally changed the demographic and cultural character of the region. On this reading, these were not displaced primitive people seeking shelter from a hostile climate. They could be inferred to have arrived as experienced pastoralists, agriculturalists and craftspeople, carrying with them millennia of accumulated knowledge about cattle, grain, water management and social organisation. The interpretation that follows from this proposal goes like this. When the Saharan migrants arrived in the Nile Valley, they encountered a place already populated by indigenous river communities. The interaction between these populations, over centuries of contact, intermarriage, exchange and cultural blending, could have produced the demographic and technological conditions out of which Egyptian civilization eventually emerged. The first dynasty of Egypt rises around 3100 BC, which is conspicuously close to the end date of the Saharan desertification. It is a striking proposition, and it should be treated as a proposition rather than a settled fact. The genetic evidence linking specific modern Egyptian populations to specific Saharan source populations is still being assembled. The cultural transmission routes, the specific pottery styles, agricultural techniques, religious motifs that should track the proposed migration, are debated. What is more solid is the basic chronology and the geographic logic. The Sahara dried. People had to leave. The Nile was the obvious place to go. The first Egyptian dynasty appeared at the right time and in the right place to be at least partly downstream of those events. The pyramids, the hieroglyphs, the pharaohs, the entire cultural legacy of ancient Egypt may exist. On this view, in significant part because a lake larger than Germany evaporated and the refugees of an entire dying continent had to go somewhere. Whether the full causal chain runs cleanly through this hypothesis is a question that genuine specialists in the relevant fields are still working out. The Sahara is one of the only places on the planet where you can stand on bare rock and look at painted images of the wildlife that used to live where you're standing, knowing that the water and the grass and the game and the human communities are all gone. None of it because of any single catastrophe, but because the climate slowly and quietly killed it. The rock art is the autobiography of a vanished world. That is the Seventh Eurasia. An entire continent's worth of inhabited grassland, dried into dust, with its survivors carrying their knowledge to the Nile. Entry 3. The Thera eruption, approximately 1600 BC. If you sail into the modern caldera of Santorini, the harbour at the centre of the island, ringed by sheer cliffs of black and red volcanic rock that climb 300 metres above the water, you are sailing into the throat of one of the most violent eruptions in recorded human history. The cliffs are not natural mountainsides. They are the inner walls of an exploded volcano. The caldera you're floating in is the missing interior of the island, collapsed into the sea approximately 3,600 years ago in an event that ended a civilization. The eruption is conventionally called the Thera eruption, after the ancient name for the island. The civilization it ended is the Minoan civilization, the first advanced civilization in European history, predating the Greeks by close to 1,000 years. To understand what happened at Thera, you need to understand who was living in the region first. The Minoans had built something that has no precedent in the European Bronze Age, and very few parallels elsewhere in the contemporary world. They were based on the island of Crete, about 110 kilometres south of Thera, and from Crete they controlled a network of palace complexes, trading posts, and cultural outposts that spanned the entire eastern Mediterranean. The four great Minoan palaces, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, were enormous, multi-story structures with sophisticated drainage and water management, paved courtyards, ceremonial spaces, storerooms holding agricultural produce in standardized clay jars, and walls decorated with frescoes whose artistic quality would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. The Minoans had their own writing system, actually two of them, called Linear A and Cretan Hieroglyphic, neither of which has been deciphered. They had a maritime trade network reaching Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and as far west as Sicily. They had a sophisticated metallurgy, advanced ceramics, large-scale agricultural organisation, and what appears to have been a relatively peaceful internal political structure, judging by the relative absence of fortifications around their major sites. They were the dominant civilization of the eastern Mediterranean for several centuries, and on the island of Thera they had a major outpost. The settlement at Akrotiri, on the southern coast of the island, was a substantial Minoan town. Multi-storey buildings, some up to 3 floors tall, sophisticated drainage systems, frescoes covering interior walls, storage jars full of barley, oil and wine. Akrotiri was a thriving community at the time of the eruption. What happened when the volcano detonated was a VEI 7 event, among the most violent volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. The estimated ejected volume was somewhere between 28 and 41 cubic kilometres of material, which is roughly 4 times the volume of the Krakatoa eruption of 1883. The centre of the island collapsed into the sea, and the modern crescent-shaped caldera was born from that collapse. Ash from the eruption has been recovered from sediment cores in the Nile Delta, the eastern Mediterranean seabed, and even from ice cores in Greenland, more than 4,000 kilometres away. Here is the remarkable thing. When archaeologists excavated Akrotiri, they did not find what they had expected to find. Akrotiri is often described as the Pompeii of the Aegean because of its extraordinary state of preservation under volcanic ash, multi-storey buildings still standing, frescoes still on the walls, storage jars still in their cellars. But unlike Pompeii, Akrotiri contains almost no human remains. The bodies are not there. This means the population was evacuated before the final eruption. The Minoans had received warnings, preliminary seismic activity, smaller precursor eruptions, the kind of ominous geological signals that even a Bronze Age culture would recognise as dangerous, and they had left. They got off the island. Whatever ships they had, they used. Escaping the island, however, did not mean surviving what came next. When a volcano of this magnitude explodes into the sea, and a substantial section of an island collapses into deep water, the result is a tsunami, not a small one. Modern studies, most notably the detailed inundation modelling by Novikova and colleagues published in 2011, have estimated that the northern coast of Crete, 110 kilometres south of Thera, was struck by waves that reached heights of up to 28 metres. Inundations stretched 250 to 450 metres inland from the coastline in some areas. The Minoan harbours on the northern coast of Crete, Amnisos, Malea and others, would have been entirely overwhelmed. The Minoan fleet, which was the operational foundation of their economic and military power, was almost certainly destroyed within hours. This is the moment in most documentaries about the Minoans where the story ends. Volcano, tsunami, civilization destroyed, end of story. What most people do not know, and what the archaeological record actually shows, is that the Minoans survived the eruption. They survived it by roughly 50 years. This is one of the most extraordinary facts in the entire archaeology of the Bronze Age, and it deserves to be stated carefully. The clay tablets recovered from Knossos and other major palace sites prove that the Minoan civilization continued to function as a civilization for approximately 2 generations after the Thera eruption. Linear A texts continued to be written. The palace administrations continued to record agricultural inventories. The settlements continued to be occupied. Life went on. But it was a life in slow decline. The sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere by the eruption had dimmed sunlight across the eastern Mediterranean for years. Harvests were reduced. The Minoan economy, which had depended on agricultural surplus and maritime trade, was operating without its full surplus and without its full fleet. The harbour infrastructure had been destroyed by the tsunami and had to be rebuilt with reduced labour. The trade networks contracted. The cultural prestige of the civilization eroded, and on the Greek mainland a different group of people, the Mycenaeans, who had previously been subordinate to and influenced by the Minoans, who had bought Minoan pottery and copied Minoan art, were watching. The Mycenaeans had not been hit by the volcano. Their fleets were intact, their harvests had been less affected. As the Minoan civilization weakened across the decades following the eruption, the Mycenaeans expanded. Sometime in the 15th century BC, roughly 50 years after the Thera eruption, the Minoan palaces were destroyed. Most of them by fire, possibly during a Mycenaean conquest, possibly during internal social collapse triggered by the long economic contraction, possibly some combination of both. The Linear A script disappeared. It was replaced by Linear B, which was used to write Mycenaean Greek, and which Michael Ventris famously deciphered in 1952. The Minoan language was gone. The Minoan religion fragmented and merged with incoming Greek traditions. The palaces were abandoned, repurposed, or destroyed. A civilization that had thrived for over 1,000 years was consumed by a culture that had been subordinate to it just decades earlier. And the cause, traced back through the chain of cause and effect, was a single volcanic eruption that had not even killed most of the people directly. The Thera eruption did not kill the Minoans in one afternoon. It set in motion a slow collapse that played out over a generation, and the people inside the collapse may not have understood until the very end that they were inside one. What did the world lose when the Minoans were absorbed? More than the immediate facts of their existence. The Minoan civilization had developed approaches to architecture, to administration, to artistic representation, and to social organisation that were genuinely original. Not pale copies of Mesopotamian or Egyptian models, but their own distinct experiment in what Bronze Age civilization could look like. Their religion, on the evidence of surviving frescoes and seal impressions, could be inferred to have placed unusual emphasis on female religious figures. Some of their largest ritual scenes depict women in central roles, and the absence of clearly identifiable supreme male deities in the surviving iconography has long been remarked upon by specialists. Their political organisation, judging from the absence of large public depictions of single rulers, may not have been based on the kind of god-king monarchies that dominated Egypt and the Near East. Though scholars disagree about how strong an inference this is, given how much of the original political record is gone. Their cities lacked monumental fortifications, which is so unusual for the period that it has prompted decades of debate about whether the Minoans maintained their security through naval dominance, through diplomacy, or through some other mechanism that simply did not require building walls. All of this was a different model of how a complex society could be put together. It died. The Mycenaean successor culture rebuilt civilization in the Aegean along very different lines. Fortified citadels, warrior aristocracies, a culture that produced the world depicted in the Iliad 5 centuries later. The Greek civilization that eventually emerged from the Mycenaean tradition gave us philosophy, drama, mathematics, the idea of democracy, and most of the foundational vocabulary of Western culture. But it did not inherit the Minoan way of being civilized. That inheritance was broken. We get only the artifacts, the silent palace walls, the undeciphered tablets, and the indirect Greek myths, Theseus and the Minotaur, the labyrinth at Knossos, King Minos as a judge in the underworld, that may preserve, in distorted folk memory form, fragments of what the Minoans actually were. There is a 2024 footnote to this story that is worth knowing. Scientists drilling into the seabed around Santorini have identified evidence of a far greater eruption at the same volcanic complex approximately 520,000 years ago. According to the study published in Communications, Earth and Environment, that ancient eruption, now named the Archaeos Tuff, produced pyroclastic deposits more than 90 cubic kilometres in volume, roughly 6 times larger than those of the Minoan eruption. Its deposits, where preserved, are about 30 times the thickness of the Minoan deposits. Humans were not around to witness it. But the Colombo volcanic chain, of which Santorini is one part, remains one of the most active volcanic regions in Europe today. The volcano that ended the Minoans has gone quiet for now. Its larger sibling, in the same magma system, is still down there. That is the 8th Eurasia, the first European civilization brought down by a volcano whose final act of destruction took 50 years to complete. Entry 2. The 8.2 kiloyear event, 6,200 BC. The Greenland ice sheet contains the most detailed continuous record of past climate that exists anywhere on Earth. Every year, snow falls on the surface of the ice sheet and gets compacted into a thin annual layer. Each annual layer captures, in the chemistry of its trapped water and trapped air, a snapshot of the atmospheric conditions that produced it. Drill cores extracted from the deep ice, 3,000 metres and more below the modern surface, have given paleoclimatologists access to a year-by-year record of global temperature stretching back over 120,000 years. In those cores, at a depth corresponding to approximately 8,200 years ago, there is a sharp downward spike, a sudden unambiguous cold event. It begins quickly. It lasts roughly 160 years. It ends about as quickly as it began, and it leaves a clear, undeniable signature in the oxygen isotope ratios of the ice. This is the 8.2 kiloyear event, and it tells us something extraordinarily important about the relationship between climate stability and human civilization. Because by 6,200 BC, when this event hit, our species had committed itself to a way of life that depended absolutely on climate consistency. We had become farmers. To understand what happened, we need to go back to North America. When the last great ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of Canada and the northern United States, was retreating at the end of the Pleistocene, it left behind enormous proglacial lakes along its southern margin. The largest of these, Lake Agassiz, covered an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined at its maximum extent. As the ice continued to melt, Lake Agassiz merged with a neighbouring lake, Lake Ojibwe, forming a single enormous freshwater body covering an area larger than the modern Caspian Sea, holding an estimated 163,000 cubic kilometres of fresh water. This merged lake was dammed by the remaining ice, specifically by the eastern remnant of the Laurentide ice sheet, sitting in what is now Hudson Bay. The lake was held back by ice on one side, by the geology of the Canadian Shield on the others. For thousands of years, as the climate continued to warm and the ice continued to retreat, the lake grew, and then, approximately 8,200 years ago, the ice dam failed. The exact mechanism of the failure is still debated, whether it was a sudden catastrophic collapse or a slightly slower drainage through a developing tunnel system. But the result is recorded in the geological evidence with unusual clarity. That entire volume of fresh water accumulated over millennia drained into the Labrador Sea. Some estimates suggest the drainage happened in a matter of weeks. Others propose it took several years. Either way, the volume of fresh water released into the North Atlantic in the geological blink of an eye was enormous. The North Atlantic responded the way the ocean always responds to a sudden injection of fresh water at high latitudes. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the same conveyor belt of warm tropical water that delivers heat to northern Europe, and that, when disrupted, plunges the northern hemisphere into climate chaos, slowed dramatically. With less heat being transported north, temperatures across the North Atlantic and the surrounding continents dropped. The global average temperature decrease has been estimated at 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, but around the North Atlantic itself, in northern Europe, in the Mediterranean basin, in the Near East, the cooling was far more severe. Some regional estimates put the temperature drop at up to 5 degrees Celsius, growing seasons shortened by weeks. Frost dates moved into months that had previously been frost-free. Mountainous areas got snow that had not seen snow in millennia. This is the moment where the 8.2 kiloyear event becomes important for human history. By 6,200 BC, the Neolithic Revolution was well underway. Across the Fertile Crescent, the great arc stretching from the Levant through Mesopotamia to southwestern Anatolia, communities had been practicing agriculture for nearly 4,000 years. They had domesticated wheat, barley, peas, lentils, sheep, goats and cattle. They had built permanent settlements with mud brick walls and shared storage facilities. They had developed pottery. The population of the region was rising. Some of the earliest substantial towns in human history, Jericho, Çatalhöyük, Tell Sultan, others, were already old by Neolithic standards. These communities had committed to a way of life that hunter-gatherers had not. They were locked in. They could not pick up and move at the first sign of trouble the way mobile foraging populations could. Their wealth was in their land, in their stored grain, in their domesticated animals, in their permanent structures. They depended on annual harvests. Annual harvests depended on consistent weather. When the climate broke, the consequences were immediate and severe. The archaeological record across the Near East and southeastern Europe shows clear evidence of sudden settlement abandonment at exactly this period. Sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries were left vacant. some communities shifted away from grain agriculture and back toward pastoralism, herding being more flexible than farming in unstable conditions. Some moved south, into more reliably warm latitudes. Some moved up into higher elevations where they may have hoped for different microclimates. Migrations crisscrossed the region. The neat narrative of steady Neolithic expansion that some textbooks present is, in reality, dotted with collapses and recoveries at sites like this. In Anatolia, the great early Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük went through significant disruption. Sites in northern Mesopotamia show climate-driven changes in settlement patterns. Even in the Aegean, in the prelude to the cultures that would later become the Minoans, there are signs of demographic shifts and changing agricultural practices. The crucial lesson of the 8.2 kiloyear event is not the size of the disaster itself. It is the lesson about who is vulnerable. A glacial-era hunter-gatherer band would have noticed a 1 to 3 degree cooling event, but would have adapted within a single generation by following the game and moving with the climate. A modern industrial city, with global supply chains and stored reserves, would also adapt. At significant cost, but it would adapt. The communities that were destroyed by the 8.2 kiloyear event were specifically the early agricultural villages, the people who had bet everything on the assumption that the climate would stay roughly the same from one decade to the next. That assumption was wrong. It had been wrong before, it would be wrong again. The 8.2 kiloyear event is, in a sense, the prototype for every climate-driven civilizational collapse that has followed. The event itself was relatively short by climate standards. The cold spike lasted about 160 years. Then the AMEC stabilized again, temperatures recovered, and the Holocene continued its long, warm period of climate consistency. But for the people who lived through the cold years, the long-term recovery was little comfort. Their fields had failed, their granaries had emptied, their children had migrated to other regions and started new lives among new people. The communities that had existed before the event were not the communities that existed after it. Continuity had been broken. That is the 9th erasure. An ice dam failed in central Canada, and farming villages a continent away discovered that the climate had stopped cooperating with their 5,000-year experiment. Entry 1. The 4.2 kiloyear event 2200 BC. We have reached the final and most consequential entry on this list, and before going further, a clarification that the rest of this entry depends on. The event we are about to discuss, the 4.2 kiloyear event, around 2200 BC, is sometimes confused, in popular accounts, and even in some careless documentaries, with the Late Bronze Age collapse. They are not the same event. The Late Bronze Age collapse occurred around 1177 BC. That is 1,000 years later than the 4.2 kiloyear event. They are completely separate catastrophes, with different causes, different victims, and different consequences. The Late Bronze Age collapse ended the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and the city of Ugarit. That is a different story for a different time. The 4.2 kiloyear event ended a different set of civilizations entirely, and it did so for different reasons. With that established, let me set the scene. By 2200 BC, human civilization had been building for 2,000 years. The Neolithic revolution had given way to the Bronze Age. Cities had emerged, then larger cities, then small kingdoms, then the first true empires. Writing had been invented in multiple places independently. Astronomical observations were being made and recorded. Law codes were being written down. Trade networks reached across thousands of kilometers, connecting tin sources in Afghanistan to bronze foundries in Mesopotamia, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa to workshops in Egypt, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Central Asia to royal tombs along the Mediterranean coast. 3 great civilizations dominated the inhabited world. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad in the 24th century BC, was the world's first true empire, a unified political entity stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north, controlling all of Mesopotamia, much of the Levant, and significant parts of Anatolia. By 2200 BC, the Akkadian Empire had been the dominant power in the region for over a century. Its administrative system, its standardized weights and measures, its tax collection apparatus, its road network. All of it was unprecedented in human history. In northeast Africa, the Old Kingdom of Egypt had been ruling for nearly 1,000 years. The pyramids of Giza, built during the 4th dynasty around 2500 BC, were already over 2 centuries old. The Egyptian state had centralized authority under the pharaohs, organized the construction of monumental architecture on a scale that has never been entirely replicated, and developed the institutional machinery of a long-distance governance, taxation, regional administration, irrigation maintenance, that allowed a complex society to function continuously for generations. In the Indus Valley, on the floodplains of the rivers that flow westward across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, was at its height. Estimated total population, somewhere between 1 and 5 million people. Cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had populations in the tens of thousands. The Indus people had a written script that has not yet been deciphered. They had sophisticated urban planning with grid-pattern streets, covered sewage systems, and standardized brick sizes used across hundreds of separate settlements. They traded with Mesopotamia. They had bathhouses, granaries, and what may have been the world's first municipal water supply systems. These were not primitive societies. They had every kind of cultural and technological sophistication that any civilization before the Industrial Revolution would have. And then, almost at the same time, all three of them collapsed. The cause, traced through the speleothem records of caves in Israel and China and Italy, through the marine sediment cores of the Gulf of Oman, through the fossil coral records of the Arabian Sea, through the lake sediments of East Africa, is the same. The rain stopped. The 4.2 kiloyear event was a prolonged aridification, a multi-century drought event that affected precipitation patterns simultaneously across the entire planet. It lasted approximately 200 to 300 years. Long enough that the children of the parents who had experienced the first failed harvests grew up in a permanently drier world and had children of their own who would never know anything else. Speleothem records, the chemistry of cave stalagmites which form layer by layer from dripping mineral water and which preserve a precise record of past precipitation, show the event clearly in cave records on 3 continents. It is one of the most globally synchronous climate events in the entire Holocene record. The mechanism is still being investigated. The most likely culprit is a fundamental shift in atmospheric circulation patterns, a combination of changes in monsoon strength, in the position of the intertropical convergence zone, and possibly in the strength of the AMOC, all combining to redistribute global precipitation away from the regions that had supported the early civilizations and toward regions that were sparsely populated. A 2019 study of fossil corals from Oman, published in the journal Geology, identified prolonged winter shamal seasons, strong, dry, dust-laden winds blowing across the Arabian Peninsula coinciding with this period. The dust loaded into the atmosphere reduced rainfall over the irrigated lands of southern Mesopotamia. Salt from the dust accumulated on the irrigated fields. Soil salinization spread. The crops failed. Now let us walk through each of the 3 civilizations and what happened to them. The Akkadian Empire was the most thoroughly studied of the 3 collapses. In 1993, the archaeologist Harvey Weiss at Yale University published a landmark paper connecting the abrupt abandonment of Tel Leilan, a major urban centre in northeastern Syria, to the climate event. Tel Leilan had been a thriving city. Population in the tens of thousands, paved streets, multi-storey buildings, agricultural surplus filling its storerooms. Then, at the exact period corresponding to the onset of the 4.2 kiloyear event, the site was simply abandoned. No war, no plague, no conquest. The population left. The desert moved in. Wind-blown dust accumulated over the abandoned streets and accumulated for centuries. Across Mesopotamia, the records describe the human response in painful detail. After Akkadian central authority broke down, the Gutians, a tribal people from the Zagros Mountains, overran what remained of the empire around 2150 BC. The wider regional response to the continuing drought and ongoing pressure from migrating pastoral populations played out across the next several generations. During the Ur III period, the recovery dynasty that re-established centralized authority in southern Mesopotamia, the king Shu-Sin oversaw the construction of a 180-kilometer wall between the Tigris and Euphrates. The repeller of the Amorites, in the Akkadian inscriptions, a wall built specifically to control the flow of nomadic population southward. It is one of the earliest known attempts in human history to address climate-driven migration through physical infrastructure. It did not work. The Amorites moved through and around it. Within another century, an Amorite dynasty would be ruling Babylon, and the most famous Amorite king of all, Hammurabi, would issue his law code to a city built by the descendants of the very people the wall had been meant to keep out. In Egypt, the Nile floods, the annual inundation on which all Egyptian agriculture depended, began to fail. The Nile is fed primarily by the Ethiopian highlands, and the failures of the East African monsoon during the 4.2 kiloyear event reduced the river's flow dramatically. A series of exceptionally low floods is recorded in Egyptian inscriptions after approximately 2150 BC. Anktifi, a regional official, left an inscription on his tomb describing the entire south of Egypt dying of hunger. People eating their own children, the strong taking grain from the weak by force, the Nile drying low enough to walk across in places where it should have been a kilometre wide. The centralised Egyptian state, the same state that had built the pyramids of Giza, lost the ability to maintain authority. The pharaoh's tax collectors could not collect from regions that had no harvest to give. Provincial governors began acting as independent rulers. Civil order broke down. What followed is known to historians as the First Intermediate Period, a roughly century-long stretch of political fragmentation that Egyptian later writers would remember as a dark age, a time when the gods had abandoned the land and the world had broken down. The Indus Valley civilization tells the most mysterious story of the three, partly because the Indus script has not been deciphered, and we have no internal accounts of the collapse to read. What the archaeological evidence shows is this. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, a major Indus tributary that some scholars associate with the Vedic Sarasvati River, weakened progressively as monsoon patterns shifted. Smaller settlements were abandoned first. The great cities followed. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the two most studied Indus urban centres, were not destroyed in any kind of violent end. They simply emptied out layer by layer over the course of several generations. The standardised weights stopped being used. The script stopped being written. The trade with Mesopotamia ended. By 1900 BC, the entire Indus Valley civilization had effectively ceased to exist as an integrated cultural entity. The population scattered, moved eastward into the Ganges basin, and over the centuries that followed, merged into the later cultures that would, much later, become the foundation of historical Indian civilization. But the original Indus people, the people who had built Mohenjo-Daro, who had used standardized brick sizes across an entire subcontinent, who had drained their cities with sewage systems that would not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years, are gone. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called themselves. We have their ruins, their pottery, their seals, and their undeciphered script. That is all. Here is the part that makes this entry so important. The Akkadians did not know about the Egyptian famine. The Egyptians had no concept of the Indus Valley's collapse. The Indus people, as far as we can tell, did not know that an empire in Mesopotamia was being dismantled by the same climate event that was emptying their own cities. Each civilization experienced its destruction as a local and unique catastrophe, a regional drought, a punishment from gods, a failure of leadership, a curse, an unexplained ecological disaster. None of them understood that the same atmospheric force was dismantling human achievement across the entire inhabited world simultaneously. It would take more than 4,000 years before anyone living on Earth had the scientific tools to recognise that those three collapses were the same event. We did not know what the 4.2 kiloyear event was as a singular global phenomenon until the late 20th century. The civilizations that died inside it died without ever understanding what was killing them. There is an additional regional consequence that deserves mention. While the three major civilizations on the Mesopotamian-Egyptian-Indus axis are the most studied victims of the event, the same climate disruption affected smaller cultures around the world, and in some cases dismantled them as completely as it dismantled the empires. In northern China, the late Longshan culture, the Neolithic predecessor of the dynasties that would later become the Shang and the Zhou, went through a period of significant settlement contraction and population redistribution during exactly this window. In coastal Peru, several of the earliest known monumental sites in the Americas, places like Caral and Aspero, which had supported some of the oldest complex societies in the New World, were abandoned or significantly downscaled. In sub-Saharan Africa, the desertification that had begun 1,000 years earlier accelerated into its final phase, pushing the last pastoral communities out of the central Sahara and into the surviving wet regions to the south. The 4.2 kiloyear event was not a regional drought, it was a planetary reorganization. In 2018, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, the body that defines the official subdivisions of geological time, made a remarkable decision. They formally designated the 4.2 kiloyear event as the boundary marker for the current geological age. The age we are living in now has a name. It is called the Megalayan Age. It began approximately 4,200 years ago. The official scientific definition of the era we inhabit is, in effect, that it started when it stopped raining over the first empires. We are living, by formal scientific designation, in the age that began with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and the Indus Valley Civilization. The choice of marker is not arbitrary. Stratigraphers chose this event specifically because it is unambiguously recorded in geological deposits on every inhabited continent, because its timing is constrained tightly by multiple independent dating methods, and because its consequences for humanity are deeper and more measurable than almost any other event in the recent geological past. A specific stalagmite from the Maumlu cave in Meghalaya, in northeastern India, hence the name of the age, was selected as the official global stratotype, the physical reference object against which the boundary is defined. This means something almost shocking when you put it plainly. The current geological age is officially named for a cave formation in India, whose chemistry preserves the moment when monsoon failure killed 3 civilizations. There is, in the formal scientific language of geological timekeeping, no clearer statement of how thoroughly human history sits inside climate history. We are not the species that conquered nature. We are the species whose entire recorded existence is bracketed on the front end by a drought that ended 3 empires and that we have scientifically agreed to use as the starting point of our age. And the mechanisms that drove this event, the shifts in monsoon strength, the alterations of atmospheric circulation, the slow weakening of the AMOC, the redistribution of global precipitation, are not historical curiosities. They are descriptions of geophysical processes. Those processes did not end when the rain returned to Mesopotamia. They continue to operate. They have continued to operate for the past 4,200 years. They are operating right now in the same atmosphere, with the same fundamental physics, in the same ocean basins on the same Earth. That is the 10th erasure, the drought that gave its name to the age we still live in. 10 erasures. 10 worlds the Earth did not keep. A flood so violent that it filled a continent-sized basin in years, and from that flood came the sea on which the entire arc of classical civilization would later sail. A volcanic explosion that may have reduced our entire species to a few thousand survivors. A continent in the North Sea that drowned by inches over thousands of years and was finished off in a single afternoon by a wave that rose from beneath the seabed off the coast of Norway. A freshwater lake that became a salt sea, possibly within months, and from that rising water came the drowning of the early agricultural communities of southeastern Europe, and perhaps every flood myth from Gilgamesh to Genesis. A climate catastrophe that wiped the megafauna off North America and replaced the first known continental human culture with silence. A green continent that turned over centuries into the largest hot desert on the planet, and from that drying came the refugees who would help seed the first dynasties of Egypt. A volcanic eruption that did not destroy a civilization in an afternoon, but set in motion a 50-year decline that consumed it from within. An ice dam in central Canada that failed once and broke the climate of 3 continents for 160 years. And finally, a global drought so synchronized and so devastating that the geological age we are currently living through, the age our civilization is built inside, is officially named after it. There is a temptation, looking at a list like this, to read a kind of secret meaning into it, to find the pattern, to extract the hidden rhythm of catastrophe that supposedly arrives on schedule and erases worlds with grim regularity. That reading is not what this list supports. These events do not arrive on schedule. They are not connected to each other by any single underlying cause. The Zanclean flood and the 4.2 kiloyear event have nothing to do with each other, except that they both happened on the same planet. There is no countdown clock. There is no pattern. What there is instead is something perhaps more disquieting. The Earth has produced 10 of these catastrophes in roughly 5.5 million years. That averages out to approximately 1 major world-altering event every 500,000 years or so, although the actual distribution is far more clustered than that, with several occurring within the last 12,000 years alone. And the mechanisms that produced these disasters, the volcanic chains, the ice sheets that still exist over Greenland and Antarctica, the ocean circulation systems that still distribute heat from the tropics to the higher latitudes, the monsoon patterns that still feed the rains that grow the crops that feed billions of people, are all still in operation right now. The volcanoes that erupted at Toba and at Thera have not been removed from the planet. The magma chambers underneath them have continued to refill in the millennia since. The Colombo volcanic chain, which includes Santorini, is one of the most active volcanic regions in Europe. The Yellowstone supervolcano in the western United States, the Campi Flegrei caldera near Naples, the volcanic system underneath the Indonesian archipelago. All of these are systems capable, in principle, of producing eruptions of catastrophic regional or hemispheric impact, with Yellowstone in particular having produced past eruptions in the same VEI 8 class as Toba itself. They have been quiet, on our timescale, for a while. The ice sheets that drained into the North Atlantic 8,200 years ago no longer exist in that configuration, but the Greenland ice sheet is melting. The West Antarctic ice sheet is melting. Both of those processes have the potential, depending on the rates at which they accelerate, to deliver freshwater pulses to the North Atlantic that could affect the AMOC. The geological precedent for what happens when an AMOC disruption coincides with a population that depends on agriculture is on this list. It is the 8.2 kiloyear event. It is the Younger Dryas. The mechanisms are not different. The atmospheric physics has not changed. The monsoons that failed during the 4.2 kiloyear event have not become more reliable since. The processes that shift their strength and their position, the orbital cycles, the ocean temperature gradients, the atmospheric circulation patterns, all of those are continuing to evolve. We monitor them now in ways that ancient civilizations could not, and we have early warning systems and food storage and trade networks that the Akkadians did not, but the underlying vulnerability is the same. A civilization that depends on the rain coming in the right places at the right times is, by definition, a civilization that can be ended by the rain not coming. None of these disasters announced themselves to the populations they destroyed. None of them negotiated. The Akkadians did not get a memo explaining that the global monsoon system was reconfiguring. The Minoans did not have a seismic warning system that gave them more than a few weeks' notice. The hunter-gatherers of Doggerland did not know that a section of seabed the size of Scotland was about to fail off the coast of Norway. None of them understood, until it was finished happening to them, that they were inside one of these events. Most of them did not understand it even then. There is a particular cognitive limit that this list reveals, and it is worth naming clearly. Human beings are, in general, quite good at perceiving threats that match templates we have already encountered. A predator, a rival group, a short-term food shortage, a flood that overtops a familiar river. These are the dangers our cognitive machinery was built to track, because for the long evolutionary history of our species, these were the dangers that mattered. What we are demonstrably bad at perceiving is slow change distributed across multiple human generations. A monsoon belt that has been weakening for 3 decades, a regional aquifer that has been slowly dropping for a century, a coastline that has been retreating on average by a few millimetres a year for several lifetimes. By the time those processes produce a recognisable crisis, they have already been running for so long that no living person remembers when they started. The Akkadians did not see the drought coming because the drought had been intensifying across the lives of their grandparents. The Doggerland communities did not see the drowning of their continent as a single event because no individual member of those communities ever lived through the whole process. The Sahara dried out across roughly 50 human generations. The Indus Valley emptied across about 10. None of these populations were stupid. None of them were uniquely unprepared. They were operating with the same basic cognitive equipment that every population alive today is operating with. They simply could not see, from inside their lifespans, the shape of the change happening to the world around them. There is no obvious reason to think we are exempt from this limitation. The Mediterranean Sea was created by a flood so violent that it dwarfs every war that has ever been fought on its shores. Every map ever drawn of that sea is, in a sense, a map of catastrophe. Every human alive today in their DNA may carry the signature of a near-extinction event, the moment when our species came so close to vanishing that we still cannot quite genetically forget it. The pyramids of Egypt may exist only because a lake larger than Germany dried out and the refugees from a dying continent had to find somewhere else to go. The fact that you exist, that anyone exists to read or hear these words, depends on a long chain of survival across catastrophes whose scale dwarfs anything in living memory. The world we live in was not given to us. It was left behind. It is what the Earth produced after all of these events finished happening. It is the rubble of the world that came before, recycled into the appearance of permanence. The cities you have lived in are built on the ruins of older cities, which were built on the ruins of older cultures, which were built on places that no longer exist, drowned and dried and frozen and rewritten by forces that have not, in any meaningful sense, retired. What lasts is not what was strongest. What lasts is what happened to be in a place the catastrophe missed. The mammoth in the Siberian ice was eating buttercups when it died. The Akkadian official Anktifi watched people eat their children. The inhabitants of the last island of Doggerland were standing on a low coastal flat when the sea withdrew and then returned as a 20-metre wall. None of them knew, none of them the moment before, had any sense that the world they were living in was about to be erased. We are no different. We are just the latest version. We have more instruments. We have more knowledge. We know that the volcanoes are still there and the ice is still melting and the monsoons are still shifting. We have, on the question of what to do about any of this, the same collection of half-measures and arguments and procrastinations and political incapacities that every civilization on this list also had. There is one final consideration that the geological record raises, and that no responsible summary of these 10 events should leave unsaid. Every previous civilization on this list collapsed under the pressure of a single catastrophe, acting on a single regional system. The Akkadians had a drought. The Minoans had a volcano. The Doggerland communities had a flooding sea and then a tsunami. The Indus people had a shifting monsoon. In each case, the disaster came from one direction, addressed one vulnerability, and the affected civilization either adapted or did not. The civilizations that did not adapt are the ones on this list. What our era faces is not a single catastrophe acting on a single vulnerability. It is the possibility of multiple geophysical systems entering states of change simultaneously. Ice sheet dynamics, ocean circulation, monsoon distribution. Volcanic activity is roughly constant on geological timescales, but has its own statistical clock. Pandemic risk, while not strictly geophysical, has a similar character of low probability, high consequence emergence. None of these systems are independent of the others. Climate change affects ocean circulation, which affects monsoon patterns, which affects agricultural viability, which affects migration patterns, which affects political stability. The chain of consequences runs in both directions. A civilization addressing only one of these vulnerabilities, while the others continue to evolve, is in the position of a Bronze Age society that knew about earthquakes but had no concept of volcanic eruption. The world has erased entire worlds before ours. The geological record is unambiguous on this point. Whether ours will be on a future list of erasures, whether some future intelligence, human or otherwise, will one day study the rubble of our cities the way we study the rubble of Mohenjo-Daro, is a question that depends on choices we are making right now, in the era that began the last time the rain stopped over the first empires. 10 worlds gone. The Earth did not announce them. It did not mourn them. It produced them, and it produced what came after, and it is still producing. Whatever is next is still down there.